All right, and so welcome everybody, and welcome to the attendees who are coming on. We do have about 160 odd people registered for this, so it should be a pretty full crowd. Very much looking forward to it, and that says there's significant interest around the particular topic we're talking about today, which is around entrepreneurship in high schools. And these conversations that we've been having on Thursdays over the last 6 weeks or so are really focused on how we support and build the Entrepreneur Support Network, or otherwise known as the innovation ecosystem within Australia. And the audience for this is much like the people around the panel today, the builders, the people actually supporting building capacity and capability in the innovation ecosystem across Australia. And this came about 6 weeks ago when Di and myself and a few others we're discussing, like, how do we support those who support others? A lot of stuff out there for entrepreneurs, a lot of things out there for programs and for actual delivery, but how do we help us? How do we do our job better? And so that's what this is all about. My name is Csiro. I'm the Managing Director for the Global Entrepreneurship Network in Australia, a CEO of a company called Startup Status, as well as Research Fellow with QUT and USQ. And I'm also joined by Di as a co-host with Bridge Hub, and she'll share a little bit more about what she does. And our job here really is just trying to, how do we help other people, both the people who are participants logging in, as well as the people around the panel here. Just a bit of housekeeping for participants that are logging in. Unlike an actual physical event, we do invite you to chat away amongst yourselves in the chat room, talk to your heart's content. If you want to comment or give thoughts on what the panelists are talking about at any given time, feel free. If you have any questions, we invite you to ask those in the Q&A. At the bottom of your Zoom browser, you should see a button that says Q&A. Click on that and you can ask a question. We're going to be using that to then filter through what we talk about in the last 20 minutes or so of this conversation. And you can also go in there to upvote and downvote, those kind of things. So feel free to chat, and between Di and I, we'll be kind of looking through the chats as well. But if you have an actual question, put it in the Q&A. And with that in mind, the conversation today is really around entrepreneurship in high schools. And that's a pretty in-depth topic to unpack, even as we were chatting a little bit before the session started. Specifically, when we talk about the topic, quite often it's how do, things that come up are, how do you embed curriculum into high schools and get entrepreneurship embedded that way? As well as you have a lot of programs out there that are being run in schools, maybe after hours or as electives. And in addition to, we have programs that are run, whether it's a hackathon or a dedicated program where you can leave the school and go to it, or maybe a central area that a lot of schools participate in. And all of these have value, but what's the best portfolio approach? And what are some of the barriers and some of the enablers that having that happen? And so around the screen today, you see some panelists that can really speak to that. We have people from university developing curriculum that can then be embedded into high schools and working on that. We have people that have expertise in the actual curriculum itself, and how do you develop that as an authority? You have people that are developing programs, particularly within regional and rural areas, on how do we embed and integrate with the high schools there, and also people that are then connecting high school students to thought leaders and mentors and leaders. So really a broad spectrum along that, what you can refer to as almost the supply chain of the challenge that we're talking about. So really excited about the conversation. And Di, obviously with the work that you've been doing back with regional leadership, as well as the integration with overseas and agriculture, I imagine this topic's come up quite a bit for the stuff that you've been doing.
Definitely. So like everyone, I'm really just looking forward to hearing the experts around our room help and share with us. And I think having a child in year 7, just starting high school and being in a regional area, it's very relevant from a personal point of view. And I think having gone through the whole COVID crisis, it's interesting that we look at our kids and we go, okay, they've had a huge upheaval right now and they've had to adjust and be agile. All of those great buzzwords that we think about. And is now really such an opportunistic time to follow on and use that momentum. So just looking forward to the conversation and the questions that come. And I think it's not just, the people that here are presenting, it's the power of the cohort and the people that are online. So make sure you're chatting lots.
Yeah, absolutely, Di. It is definitely a community. And it's also, as you mentioned, so for so many people, it is personal. It's either, my own child or my community and seeing the children there. And so this is a very real topic. I'm going to open it up to the panel. And the question I want to start off with is really understanding, because again, we're as I mentioned in the email before, we're not necessarily here to make the case. We all kind of understand that this is an important topic. But what I want to hear is kind of both a dual part. What's working well as far as the approach for getting entrepreneurship in high schools, and what are some of the challenges that you've experienced? And Baden, given that you just turned off your mic, so you look raring to go, I'll start with you. Because I know this is something that's you've been passionate about for some time, and with your work that you've been doing on the Gold Coast and Bond is really a bit of a focus area. I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of where you see things moving, what's working well, and what are some of the challenges you've experienced.
Yeah, thanks, Chad, and lovely to see a whole bunch of people here turning up. And ears are certainly open, and we encourage this to be very engaging and collaborative. So I do encourage the attendees to stick up their hand and ask questions as we go. We're very welcome to respond on the fly. So what I see as real strengths of entrepreneurship education in schools at the moment is that it's gone from its early infancy of lone renegades having a bit of a shot to starting to get some real discipline in behind and a bit of a community sitting in behind what it is we're actually talking about when we talk about developing entrepreneurial capability in our youth. And I think this is not just an Australian phenomenon. There are exemplars around the world from which we can draw, and some significant research has been put into understanding entrepreneurship as a discipline itself, something that sits as a transdisciplinary capability, a set of skills and capabilities that is applicable not just for people who are starting businesses, but also for people who are going to become employees of organizations, and it's something for everybody. So I think that's one of its real strengths. I think we're starting to see some really well researched and evidence-based approaches being shared online. There are many resources once you start digging into understanding what it is that you're looking for that can guide an initial person who's having a bit of a go at a school to say, oh, I can reach out to this person, or here's the Discipline Entrepreneurship book from MIT, or whatever it happens to be, right? That body of knowledge does exist, and it puts in place a very good base from which early movements can be made. That's what I see as a big strength. I think one of its big challenges is that for a long time we haven't really known what we've been talking about, and we're still developing a coherent voice as to what entrepreneurship education is and what it looks like and what it is we're trying to achieve. And I think that'll be one of the outcomes from our collective efforts.
Thanks for that, Baden. And Alex, you've also been working in a bit as far as the approach, and one of the things we have talked about in the past is, like, do we actually know what we're trying to achieve? We talk about entrepreneurship in school, and as Baden said, we've got this body of knowledge, but like, what is it about the definitional piece? What don't we know? Like, surely we should just be able to do quote unquote entrepreneurship in schools. Like, where are the gaps that you see?
Yeah, it's a strange thing that people still haven't decided in the academic sphere, like what it actually is. It's something that I get quite frustrated by, because I'm more of a practitioner than an academic. So the conversation and the debate isn't as interesting as like getting my hands dirty. But it sometimes is quite important when you start to think about, well, is entrepreneurship business? And just that, it's like, well, there's lots of school of argument to say, well, it is just starting business. But I don't think that is true. And I think most people who aren't in the business world would agree that an artist can be very entrepreneurial. But then you start to get a slippery slope, and you start to claim that everything is entrepreneurial, and that it's doing anything, you know, outside of the box is entrepreneurial. And that's when it starts to lose all of its power, because you've suddenly cast the net so wide that suddenly everything is entrepreneurship, and therefore nothing is entrepreneurship. And so I think the definition piece, although it seems a bit arbitrary and silly, it is really important to actually nail that, because we need to be sure that everybody is on the same page, and that when we're teaching entrepreneurship, that is, everybody is agreeing what outcomes we want. And yes, making a business might be one of them, but that isn't the only goal.
Interesting, Alex. And Matt, I'm going to throw over to you, even though I know Liz is probably thinking, you know, like, because you're focused on mindset and some thoughts there. Matt, you've been doing a lot of stuff in, like, not just schools, but like across entire regions. So when we talk about, you know, just this statement of embedding entrepreneurship in schools, are we asking young people to start a business? Is it a new way of thinking? Is it just, changing the mindset a little bit on existing curriculum? What are we actually talking about here?
Look, it's a great question, and it's one we grapple with every day, because one of our kind of key tenets for how we go about our work is that if we're in a community and we're only engaging with government, or only engaging with education sector or the community sector or the business sector, we reckon we've failed already in terms of growing out that localised ecosystem. And so language is important around how it divides and is inclusive. And look, the best terminology that we've been able to come up with, regardless of sector, regardless of age, regardless of socioeconomic background, is this idea that our young people not only need to learn the skills, the mindset, skills and behaviours to see themselves as job seekers in the future, which our education system's been tremendously successful at doing, is that they also need to equally be able to see themselves as job creators. And that's doubly important in rural and regional and remote areas who have suffered most of the sort of structural decline in traditional industries and kind of entry level jobs. When it comes to entrepreneurship, we talk about it as starting an enterprise. So it can be a social enterprise or a commercial enterprise, but it's starting a new enterprise that wasn't already there. And most often the characteristic or the key ingredient is that people don't have the resources to actually get it off the ground. So you actually got to be nimble, you've got to be agile, you've got to go and find new things. It's not business as usual. It's actually creating something that's brand new.
Thanks, Matt. And I think definitely it's interesting, we've gone through a few speakers and the definition of what is entrepreneurial. And we all are coming at this from such different angles and experiences. And for me, I think there's little bits of all of this that ring true. Chad, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Di. Because as Matt was saying, there's this notion of starting a business, but I'm also picking up, Aaron Berkby in the chat said, I actually feel the opposite. I feel the broader definition of entrepreneurship as a mindset actually makes it more powerful. And it is this, then how do you develop that mindset? It's not the actual thing you build, it's who you are as you build the thing. That's kind of that notion that we have. And Liz, you connect young people to people that are actually building it to try and get that transference from leader to both encourage the mindset and also be interested in the work that you do. How many of those young people then do you know go on to actually build businesses and be entrepreneurs as well as being entrepreneurial?
Thanks for that, Chad, and thanks everyone for your earlier comments, and welcome to everybody. Chad, in response to that, I think the real challenge, and I'll go back to when I first started teaching this in 2015 in my classroom, what I noticed is that teachers often feel alone in this process. And there are so many experts and university partners and people from government who have expertise in these areas. And it's a matter of seeing, thinking and understanding from a teacher perspective how we can think differently about our approach to teaching, and actually engaging these people on that journey with us is where it really opens our own mindset to what the possibilities are. I'm currently working with 21 schools across regional New South Wales, and the biggest issue that teachers have found is they feel as though they don't have the opportunity to be able to connect to these people because they can't see the connections and the alignments. And as soon as I start drawing those connections between sustainable development, urban development, looking at challenges in agriculture, all of a sudden, teachers are really starting to connect with these industry experts and really seeing the value and the power of having these people as role models in the classroom so that young people can see who it is that they want to become as they grow, and feeling as though it is something that is really achievable and things that they can see themselves doing. So that's a really powerful tool of reaching out to local heroes, local community members who are, as Matt was talking about, showing expertise and excellence in their local communities and showing these young people that it is within reach. You don't have to go beyond your community to see that happen. But imagine if you do, what then is the impact that you can have on your own community. So I've seen a lot of value creation, connection and opportunity happen in this particular space. And I say to teachers that if you're looking at a minimum of for communities or people to engage with, then that's a really great starting point to working out where your ideas and your work then pivots to, and what challenges your students start to think about.
Thanks for that, Liz. Julie, I do want to hop over to you then to talk about that integration of what we're talking about in the curriculum. Just before I do, though, I want to pop over to Matt real quick, just briefly, because Matt, one of the things that I picked up in a conversation you and I were having earlier is the impact that young entrepreneurs can have on the community. And the actual solving a problem for the community actually makes them a better entrepreneur, but it's engaging the entire community in that entrepreneurial mindset and almost teaching the community through the youth. This is kind of one of the things I picked up. I was wondering if you can maybe share a bit more about that.
Yeah, part of our theory of change is that there's only two things that we've ever come across that rural people in a locality agree on. And one is the opportunities for young people, and the other one is where they actually live. And so we've been kind of using the young people as a Trojan horse in terms of them developing their skills and then turning to community and saying, hey, as these ideas emerge, we need to rally around these ideas and support young people with skills development. And what it's actually drawing out of that broader community are those people who understand their role as an enabler to that sort of emerging ecosystem. But what's really important is it also brings out those people who are the inhibitors to this stuff happening. And that's as important as anything else around understanding, well, how do you get around them, or how do you block their influence? Because a lot of good ideas don't actually see the light of day in rural and regional communities, because there's a traditional status quo around how our institutions form and protect each other, and it's often at odds with what young families and young people are trying to achieve out of creating vibrant and resilient and enterprising local communities. So that's how we approach it, and young people up for being that Trojan horse. Don't worry about that.
Yeah, they're definitely keen to be those disruptors. No doubt about anything from a 10 to 18-year-old giving it a go. Julie, so we've painted a bit of a broad picture on not just the importance of it, but maybe even some of the challenges and opportunities. And Liz, you mentioned teachers, and I'm seeing some of that come up in the chat as well, where Anna's sharing one of the challenges that most teachers have no real business experience, so potentially lacking some of that credibility, or maybe just a bit of insecurity on teaching some of this stuff. How do we equip them? And also, how do we then get it potentially into the curriculum to make this a bit of just the way we do things, both from a mindset perspective, so it's not just in the business segment, as some of the people are saying, as well as maybe a dedicated profession or a career choice. Maybe share a little bit about what you do and what your thoughts are on that.
So at ACARA, I work on the technologies curriculum. That's sort of my area of expertise. And I'm currently leading a project called Digital Technologies in Focus, which is supporting 160 disadvantaged schools across the country to implement digital technology. So I've been working on that for 3 years. So it's certainly an interesting space, and technologies is definitely a space where we do have explicit references to enterprise in the curriculum. But also you'll find that in things like economics and business, in work studies. So there are places in the curriculum where you find those explicit references. But I think the transdisciplinary approach is definitely a way to go, and we've certainly explored that with some of the work we've done in STEM Connections, in looking at some projects with schools where they started to look at how they could implement transdisciplinary approaches to STEM, but many of those did work with industry as well. And it's an approach that we've taken on board with the current project, developing a bit of an ecosystem for each of the schools. So a really conscious sort of approach and diagram. Who are your industry contacts? Who are your contacts with universities? And using the curriculum officers to actually build those relationships and help teachers to have the confidence to build those relationships. And the richest projects that we had are the ones that engage with industry and make those connections. But I think I also saw in the chat about the general capabilities. We've got 7 general capabilities in the Australian curriculum, and all of them contribute to being enterprising, but particularly things like personal and social capability and developing those capacities. So I think that's a really important space to consider.
Yeah, I mean, and building up the teacher capability, as well as, I love what you're saying as far as the kind of integrating it within the curriculum. Based on what Julie said, maybe just going around the room, I wouldn't mind hearing, we've heard some of the opportunities, potentially some of the challenges. I want to spend the next, say, 15 minutes or so talking about, so what needs to happen? Like when we look at a broad sense, like we are, you know, relative to other nations, some of our scores are slipping. Some of our entrepreneurial capability is going down compared to, say, some of the OECD. So we know we need to do some things, and that's as a nation, and when they go rural and regional, it can be slipping even more. And so I'd love to hear from the panel, and there's about, you know, 160 people registered for it. We got almost 100 people listening right now. If you could do anything in the next 3 to 6 months, what are some of the initiatives that we need to implement? Julie's been working on some of this stuff for 3 years now. Is there anything that needs to change to drive this forward even more, whether it's embedding into curriculum, more advancement in extracurricular work? What needs to happen?
I'm happy to take this away to start with. I can see all the great messages that people are putting forward in talking about teachers and the types of skills that teachers need. I think the important part about getting started is those people who are doing incredible things in their classrooms, it'd be great for you to share what you're doing so that other people can understand what success looks like in your environment. And there's some exceptional schools that have been working on programs for quite a number of years now, and who are actually transitioning to creating enterprising programs in their school curriculum in a variety of different subjects, in leadership areas as well. So I think in the short term, raise your hand, show us what's going on in your communities so that we can spread that news to people, and then, you know, create a repository of people who are sharing resources in this space. Because the hardest part as a teacher is starting and thinking that you have to start from scratch when there are so many things going on out there. It's about how do we create a culture of sharing, and how do we make more informed decisions based on collecting data that already exists and how that can inform us moving forward.
Yeah, definitely sharing those stories, getting it out there, creating those examples, because quite often we just don't know what we don't know. And there's some really good resources out there already for different types of STEAM and STEM programs, but, you know, even the entrepreneurial programs themselves. What are some of your other thoughts? What needs to happen?
I've got a view that I'd love to be able to shout as loud as I possibly can, and it's to your point, Liz. I think any big movement needs exemplars to be celebrated, and perhaps those who are on this call are probably already involved with a lot of different endeavours that are happening within schools. So one of the things that could come out of this particular webinar is a collection of the current initiatives that are represented by the 89 participants that are on this call. So there's my call for everyone that's on this particular call is to connect with Chad and with Di and submit some details as to what's up at your school, so that we can start to celebrate. I mean, I've just been looking through some of the list of the attendees, and Sam Reynolds, I mean, you're there, like the stuff that you're doing, St. Stephen's is just magnificent. David Todd down at Scott's, like just next level, and it's starting to spread into other schools. So that there are I know that there are people on this call that are achieving magnificent activities already, that we can start to build up a domestic Australian collection of best practice that is happening within schools currently. And then, for example, like you Sid, has been an enormous enabler of knowledge transference down into different schools in their region. So highlighting the universities that are acting as resource bases for schools and the connections that can be done that way. The work that Alex and their team are doing down there is magnificent. We do a similar activity here up on the Gold Coast. You know, there are lots of examples of best practice that are already occurring, that can be shared with others, so that when you have students, I know Meg Yo is here from St Andrews. I saw your name, and it was just maybe a couple of years ago when you first started, Meg, and reaching out and speaking to people who had already done it was an enormous heads up for you. So that's one thing we can do, to celebrate from the rafters all the things that are already happening in the Australian high school scene, both extracurricular through programs such as what Liz and Matt deliver into schools and into communities, but also those that are being formed within schools and supported by partners.
Excellent. Thanks, Baden. And to that point, just so everybody knows, Baden already referred to it. After this, we will be sending out an email with a survey. And that survey will be asking you not only about what you do, but how you want to be involved moving forward. This event that we're having today actually represents a bit of a shift where we're not just having a webinar talking about the challenges, but we're actually going to be executing on some of these. Whatever comes up out of here, spinning up some project teams to say, great, let's actually crack this. And we're saying it now, but let's actually do it. And in 6 months, can we point back to this day to make a bit of a difference? And so you'll be getting a survey out there saying, how do you want to be involved? Do you want to be a part of that team? And how do we advance it forward? And if there's other people saying, hey, look, I've actually already did that last March, great, then we can just build on whatever that is. And on that point, Baden, you already called out a bit to some of the program side. I might hop over to Liz and Matt. Matt, maybe starting with you. Like the work that you're doing in regions, I believe, particularly across Victoria, and some of the, again, not just the schools, but the ecosystem building overall. Love to hear your thoughts on, so what needs to happen, say, particularly over the next 3 to 6 months?
Well, there's been some great work done over many years by Foundation for Young Australians around looking at what is that, what are those enterprise capabilities that are going to be required in a globalised, uncertain future where we need to start using our initiative and be entrepreneurial. And, you know, I really agree with their call, which is for a national strategy around, you know, enterprise capability development. And part of that is providing some you know, support to what I call those really high capability practitioners out there who are already globally connected in. They're using the best researchers. They've been mining international knowledge and know-how for many years already. But what they do is they lack capacity. So they've got super high capability, but they lack capacity. And I think we need to sort of take a bit of a kind of a step back approach to how elite sports do ecosystems. And what they do is they start to identify emerging talent, and then they put some of those supports around them to accelerate their journey. And I feel like that's kind of the way that we need to push the dial on this emerging great practice, because, you know, all of the people that I connect with, wow, they're doing world-class stuff with nothing in our country. And I think if we want to sustain that good practice to then sort of highlight what's possible in moving the broader community, I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Matt. And quite often when you know, at least for me in the past, say a few years back, when you had a conversation, it almost seemed like an either or proposition. Either it's in curriculum or it's outside of curriculum. But what I hear you saying is it's almost like, and also when you talk to teachers, it can be, they're just really, really busy, and how the thought leaders are doing exceptional, as you say, with very little. But how do we equip them to do better? And also, I love that the reference you made to the Foundation for Young Australians. You know, how do we leverage things that are already there and really equip those people to do better? And part of the work you do is actually bridging that gap between the two segments of people in schools and connecting them to the leaders. Much like Aaron mentioned what Julie does, being proactive in building the sustainable networks within industry. How do we bridge those gaps? So maybe with the work that you do, so what do you think would need to happen?
I think from my perspective, the biggest challenge has been finding and identifying those local heroes within communities and connecting them to schools. One of the questions that came up was about cross-curricular and working with other teachers. What I found is that by working with career advisors, working with executives and reaching out to teachers to co-create this experience, you quite often find that there are a number of teachers, whether it be English, whether it be design and technology, who have already made their own connections. And once you put all those connections together, you often find that you have a lot right in front of you. And it's about saying, okay, well, what does that look like? How much value is that going to add? I think from a global perspective, the conversations that I've seen throughout my research in being able to identify entrepreneurship from an Australian perspective is that there is varying definitions, but what teachers really need is the power to measure the success of these types of programs, and that comes back down to the skills and capabilities. What are the skills that students are learning, and how can we use entrepreneurship as a valuable way of showcasing the learning that is happening in this space, and creating standard-based assessment models and frameworks that teachers actually can use to create task and generic-based assessment on that, so that everybody, including parents and the community, can see what impact this is actually having. Are they being able to problem solve? Yes. Here's the evidence to actually support that they're working really well in this space. So a lot of my research over the next couple of years will be working with schools, asking those really hard questions about what is going on in your space, identifying, classifying, measuring, and then creating a really practical tool that teachers can actually use to constantly improve the way that they teach, or the skills that they have through entrepreneurship. Because we know that the lens of entrepreneurship changes. People in English might have their own frame of what it looks like. People in design and technology, the same as that as well. And I think the power of having leaders in this particular space who have the expertise, like Julie through the Australian curriculum and the universities, we can mirror what is already going on in the tertiary space and actually apply that to what's going on in the K-12 space. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to understand what models of success currently exist, and how can we use that to now shape the learning of our students and help better prepare them for what the world looks like.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. And so much gold in there. We're seeing some people come back saying, yes, Liz, we do need more ways to measure entrepreneur education. That one definitely will resonate with quite a few people. Julie, you've heard a lot as far as kind of what needs to happen from, how do we create better examples? How do we, in case studies that other people can learn from, really showcase what success looks like? We heard things around how do we build teacher capability? How do we provide teacher and leader capacity, particularly in regional areas? And how do we provide those tools and frameworks, which then may lead to some of the ed tech stuff? And we're seeing some people come through in the chat saying, hey, I've got this platform I'm building. Let me know if you want to know more. And even some just basic connections, like even how do we connect the thought leaders and the panelists to here? All that coming in. What do you reckon?
Yeah, look, I think there's a few things I've been jotting down as I've been listening to people. I think one of the models that has worked really well for STEM has been the CSIRO's STEM Professionals Project, where they've reached out to industry and universities, and they have a list of people who are prepared to do some mentoring activities with schools, and not just a one-off presentation, but a long-term relationship with a school or a teacher to develop their capacity. And sort of a bit like a dating app in some ways. You put in from your school, this is what I'd like to learn about. I'm really interested in doing robotics, but I don't know how to start. And then they match you up. They do all the working with children checks and so forth, and match you with the most appropriate person to assist you in that area. So I think maybe an enterprise education model of that could be really worthwhile. It might even be something that the CSIRO might be interested in looking at some other aspect of that in the work that they're currently doing. One of the things that we have done at ACARA is publish illustrations of practice. And this is one that may have gone under the radar a little bit, is careers education. So we have about 9, I think it is, illustrations of practice focused on careers education and what's happening in schools, and they've been mapped to the curriculum as to how that's being addressed. There's a really nice one in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space, which is careers education focused at Balga High School and what they've been doing. So there are some nice examples there. I think being able to showcase them more readily would be great. We do have some work samples that look at enterprise projects, particularly in relation to work studies. And we have the STEM Connections work. So we have illustrations of practice on STEM. One of the things that has worked quite nicely with the project I'm doing at the moment is to have a teacher-student matrix for judging yourself on your ICT capability or your digital technologies capability. But to do that for an enterprise one and to actually create one for that situation could be quite useful. And also curriculum connections. So we currently have them for things like food and fibre, consumer and financial literacy. So there could be the potential to look at developing those sorts of connections.
And can I just jump in there, Chad? Julie, that, you know, the work that's being currently done, I think it's really nice that you touched on that, and we're seeing that come through the chat as well. There's existing things out here that we can build on. And I think, you know, you spoke about the CSIRO model. How does that work in a regional context? And what do we need to do specifically, and I'm putting my regional hat on here, to ensure that we're connecting industry, the innovation leaders in that specific community with those schools?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what they take into consideration as well. So some of the people that they've managed to get, and some organisations have dedicated large portions of their working population to those projects. So, you know, organisations like Cisco and other large organisations. So they're distributed right around the country. They're often in places that are in sort of regional and remote areas as well. I know there's been people working in sort of, you know, the Armidale area, for example, that have expertise in science, so they've been able to connect. So I think that's capacity within that model is there, but certainly could probably be further enhanced.
And do you mind if I jump in and just add to that, on top of what you said there, Julie? I'm working with AgriFutures Australia, and for those who don't know, they're a Commonwealth statutory organisation looking at research and development in agriculture, and they've invested a significant amount of money to support students from rural and regional Australia to have an opportunity to go through this concept of understanding what's available to them in their own communities, in careers in agriculture. Not only that, the New South Wales Department of Industry have supported the 21 schools I spoke about earlier. So there are organisations out there who are more than willing to put their hand up. And I also call out to those innovation hubs. The universities have great pathways and connections to those industries. The universities all over the country, the ones that are closest to the schools, where it's all about connecting and saying, putting your hand up, can you help me? I have a question. I'd love to connect my students to here. And you'd be very surprised with what actually comes out of that. Regional Development Australia have 53 different areas around the country who are more than willing to reach out to their communities to be able to help in this aspect as well. A lot of the success that we've had so far has been through what we've been able to showcase from rural regional areas, and I'm really, really proud to learn so much about what is going on in those particular areas and sharing and showcasing the success from those spaces to the metro schools who do have a lot of access to these resources. So a huge shout out to all the rural regional communities out there who are doing really incredible things. We love sharing your stories, and people like yourself, Diane, and the work that you do in your regional communities. It only takes one person, because I see the real value in coming together and wanting to share and build people up. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to elevate each other because we're all trying to reach a common goal. And I think if we go in there with that mindset of wanting to share, lift, support, and create new opportunities, we're not only helping ourselves, but we're helping others and those around us.
Excellent. Thanks, Liz. And we might start hopping over to some of the questions and one of the things that may come up in the questions, even through the chats, is we can talk about some of the connectivity in the region and connecting innovation hubs and co-working spaces to high schools, to government, but even that body of work, like that's just, it sounds like, well, that's just what we should do. But even with that, it can be a bit of a challenge because everybody's resource tight. And Di, you would have experienced this in regional areas. Like we understand intuitively we need to do these things, but actually then making that work when everybody's time poor and resource constrained, it can be a challenge. So I think how do we think differently about that? I'd love to, before we head over to questions, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Di.
Like I think, you know, from a regional point of view, we're definitely building, and that capacity is there within our own communities. So it's about strengthening from within the community and learning those resources from outside, but it's being built from within. And then, you know, like we were on chats last week, and we were kind of talking about, well, you've just got to do it, and then don't be putting your hand out the whole time and asking where's the money. And that gets really tight for a lot of people that are churning away. So getting the balance right between investment into these things and supporting the right people, I think a lot of that comes down to duplication, and let's not duplicate across our system. You know, there's so many different programs doing very similar things, and the sharing of resources and everything that Liz was saying about coming together and collaborating. I think that might help in our, I guess, our going for that funding and that support that we do need as a whole sector rather than individuals.
Yeah,
I can continue on with that, Chad. I think there's a real opportunity for regions to look at some of their natural strengths, and we find that, especially with entrepreneurship programs, it's a natural way for parents and communities to start to engage with schools and to bring resources that typically find it difficult to engage with schools, another option and another way for them to contribute to their school community. So in a lot of the programs we run with that we have some involvement with other schools, a natural thing that they've seen happen in years 2 and 3 of running programs is that past students start to come in as mentors, and parents start putting their hands up and saying, oh, I can take somebody, you know, for an experiential experience, and it starts to expand the resources that do exist around a school, rather than just the teaching base and what they have internally. What does sit around the community of the school and activates that in a new way. It's been a surprising little outcome from some of the programs that we've seen running.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Can I just follow on there to Baden's point? You know, our work's based on a program that's been operating for 14 years in Scotland, and it is all about putting students in the driver's seat of you know, developing their own social enterprise. So identifying a cause that collectively a classroom of students care about, but instead of doing what we would traditionally like to do, which is do a fundraiser, they're actually establishing a real business. So they're getting that kind of link to their community and their connection to place, as well as building a business. But where we find the more kind of evolved teachers in that system operating really successfully is where they're bringing resources and people from outside the school gate to be part of that process. And that's actually now evolved after 4 years, where you know, some of the students across the 30 schools we've been working in act as a CEO advisor to other startup social enterprises. And these are 11-year-old kids and who've got 4 years of experience as a primary school CEO. And so, you know, they're training up other CEOs how to run successful meetings and to look at some of this sort of stuff. So we shouldn't forget that it's not all about the sort of mentors that we get out of industry, that actually a lot of these skills are actually in our communities already, and local business people, particularly in rural and regional areas and where there's lifestyle drivers, you know, they're already internationally and globally connected in with their workplaces and careers, and there's resources available. And so that's what is beautiful in being unlocked. Last year we had a real highlight in that Cisco runs a program called Global Problem Solvers. And our kids had a look at that program and decided that it could be improved a lot. And so connected in with Cisco, who now Cisco is paying these kids to enhance their global entrepreneurship program. So we shouldn't lose sight of how young and how developed our next generation are. So if we're only looking at this in high school and university, I think we've missed that sort of cultural obligation to how we renew communities in the future.
Yeah, Matt, it's just such an important piece to the fabric of community. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely, and bringing those local communities in, as Baden said as well, the alumni themselves that act as, you know, when you think about the innovation ecosystems, it's the recycled entrepreneurs, the ones that make it then come back, have quite often the most impact. And so same thing with the students, because for what I am, I can go into a school, but it's actually that person who's been out of school only for a few years comes back will have a heck of a lot more social cred. I want to get to some of the questions. I'm conscious of the time. We've got about 15 minutes left. And for everybody else who's tuning in, we're going to wrap up at top of the hour, but then we're going to keep having a bit of what we call it after the chat. So you're more than welcome to stick around and watch that. We won't be necessarily responding to questions and engaging with the chat, but we're just going to kind of let our hair down a bit and talk about what just really happened. But for the next 15 minutes or so, we'll get through a few of these questions. If you have additional questions, feel free to put them in. And if you really want us to talk about something, feel free to upvote that, because we'll be using that to determine what we talk about. I want to talk about this one just briefly if anybody has any ideas. I love the idea that Damon says, I love the idea of building a national network of schools doing things in this space, like the various associations that exist for history teachers or technology teachers. Is there an association for teachers of entrepreneurship? Is there anything else that's binding people together?
I don't know of a particular one, but certainly I could have a look at the organisation that looks after all of the national professional teacher associations and have a look in that space. So that will be the place to go to have a look for that, but not one off the top of my head.
Thanks for that, Julie. And potentially the absence of that says, well, we had 160 people rock up to say, hey, look, we need one. So maybe out of this, I'll actually form one. I want to get this one because I got like 7 upvotes from Gavin, who says, hi panel, Kempsey High in New South Wales, been running a student association program for many years, seen huge success through watching my agriculture students apply learning in action and involved with the AgriFuture Startup Business Program since 2018. Want to share with the panel my sincere support to keep working hard to find as many avenues as possible to connect entrepreneurship within schools. Thanks, Gavin, appreciate it. Given the federal government's focus is largely on evidence-based practice, which translates into funding initiatives that focus on literacy and numeracy and STEM, so we can improve our international test scores, which tends to lead to test-focused culture in many schools, how do we see schools realistically getting adequate funding, time, resourcing to implement widespread entrepreneur education at a systemic level rather than depending on the overwork and enthusiasm and networks of teachers? And this also speaks to some of the challenges. Like, again, we push STEM, but I think about me learning MS-DOS when I went to school. And are we just teaching young people the MS-DOS of tomorrow? How do we integrate that with entrepreneurial thinking? Really big question. Welcome thoughts. Alex,
I love this question because I think this whole conversation, I feel that we kind of needed a skeptical outsider during this conversation because we're all in the space. And there's this really big problem that we haven't addressed, that we are all in the space, and then there's this innovation bubble, and that there is great work happening within that bubble. And that's great, but it's not good enough. That is absolutely not good enough, because if we have such high youth unemployment coming towards us and we've already had it, this is got to be part of the answer. And the Australian government and all the schools need to be starting to take this seriously, because the fact is that trying to get into an institution like mine only works for a tiny, tiny percentage of the Australian population. So we're doing everyone a disservice by saying you need high grades to get good marks, to get into a good university, then you get good marks in university, then you get a job. That notion is nonsense. That doesn't work anymore, and you need to get hands-on experience in school as early as you possibly can so that you can actually get a job, because you have skills that they need to employ. We're not training people in universities for employment anymore, and that's rippling down into the whole process. So we've got to start thinking, how do we get this from just the innovation bubble into every teacher understands this is a priority, like it is for STEM and maths and English. It needs to be right up there as one of the top priorities for schooling, and it just isn't.
I think one of the ways to go is, one of the challenges, I suppose, with enterprise projects is often they're passion projects of teachers who are really into that space. But I think if you really want to make that systemic change, then it has to be in the curriculum, and it has to be manageability of the curriculum has to be, you know, forefront for teachers. How do we actually make this manageable? So focusing on those sort of transdisciplinary approaches, particularly for primary, and making sure that there are rich, authentic contexts that are based in a student's community so they can see what the purpose is. So one of the things that we focused on for digital technologies was asking why. Why should the students in your local community be doing digital tech? Because we did have quite a resistance from some communities that, you know, we don't need that stuff in our community. Well, actually, you know, the oyster farm down the road, did you know that they actually use digital technologies to do, you know, X, Y, Z? And so making those really strong, tangible connections for people to see, you actually develop these skills, then there is a job potentially down the road. And you can actually start to expand those options. So I think, you know, looking at the curriculum and seeing where all those opportunities are and making those really explicit to teachers, And I think making those, strong mentors for those schools so they can see where the why is. What's the reason we're doing this?
Can I just follow on from Alex's point? And I wholeheartedly agree with that sort of elephant in the room. And we've spent the last 3 years, linking what we do in social enterprise schools to the, with the support of the VCAA in Victoria, around critical and creative thinking. And the reason why we've wanted to anchor it against something that's growing, that is hopefully not going away, is because the moment it becomes compulsory for a teacher to actually have to assess children against some of these capabilities linked to entrepreneurship, is the day that we think that we're going to be able to achieve scale and cultural change. Until that day happens, we know all of the reasons why teachers are so busy, or they're expected to do way more beyond what they were trained to do, and the complicated nature of our communities, going forward. And so for us, that's what we're hanging our hat on, and we're getting great support internationally in terms of what we're doing here from people like Professor Bill Lucas, who's a kind of a world authority on enterprise education and critical and creative thinking, and he's providing his services pro bono to us. And we go, well, why are you doing this, Bill? And he goes, well, because I've been banging on about this for 10 years and no one's doing it, and you guys are starting to do it. And so I want to accelerate the practice. So, which is kind of where I think there is great practice out there, and we need to bring that capacity to the capability that already exists.
Matt, I want to throw an additional question there, and going off something that Paul mentioned in some of the questions as well. He says, absolutely live for this topic. I found principals keen to support entrepreneurship, yet some teachers lukewarm to external help. Do teachers see external help programs as weakening their position and value within the school? Has anyone experienced this? So there's a bit of that. And the other one I want to throw there is there something structurally, like we're talking about a school system, and Matt, you and I talked about this, based on A's and F's, right? And then what do we say in the entrepreneurial community? You got to fail, because that's the only way you're going to learn. And so are we actually at odds with what we're trying to achieve, trying to jam entrepreneurship and mindsets into a very structured institutional school system? Are there barriers inherent to the system?
I've got some pretty strong views on this one, Chad, that I'm happy to share. So this is exactly the point, that outcomes are a very poor measure of entrepreneurial capability. The outcome is not what we should be assessing. And so much of what we have assessed in the past has been for good assurance of learning reasons, focused on measurable outcomes that we can document and store for accreditation purposes, rather we need to start to be focusing on process-oriented attributes, and in fact, identifiers of particular motivators that are coming out through behaviors, because we know that entrepreneurs have particular motivators that are driving them. Like clarity on what sits in behind entrepreneurial capability allows you to design your assessment to be able to assess exactly what you're looking to develop. So if we're looking, we know that entrepreneurs are highly motivated by a need for achievement. So one of the things we can do within our assessment is to have very small, consistent assessment of particular behaviors where they get feedback every single week. They're assessed every week, so they're getting feedback, and they're getting motivated by the chance to achieve, to get, and failure in an approach that way has been shown through motivation research to increase motivation to achieve. So we can start to alter the way in which we design our curriculum and alter the way in which we assess, which loads on the development of the entrepreneurial capability in the first place. That's one of the things that I think is necessary in order for this to become something that can be delivered through curriculum. And I love the input that you're putting, Julie, around the opportunity that exists on how to integrate and areas where typically transdisciplinary based capabilities of skills have found their way into curriculum in the past, and being able to utilize those channels in order to be able to integrate. Because when we look at the ways in which schools begin their entrepreneurship education journey, it typically starts with Liz coming and delivering a program that has been brought in because a particular teacher has been passionate about it and wants something to get up and running. Then that teacher starts to learn the process and see what happens, and starts to read more broadly, and then starts to recognize that what they're doing in their Year 9 design subject is actually pretty close to what was being run by Liz's program. So let's just change our Year 9 design program to now be an entrepreneurship subject. We're still delivering on the curriculum requirements, and yet we've got a slight little alteration to the way in which we're assessing and what the outcomes are. And before you know it, you've got a Year 9 subject that's essentially entrepreneurship 101. The challenge becomes more onerous once we get up into the higher levels of secondary school, and continuing to enable students that show a propensity to be aligned with the entrepreneurial method to continue that through years 11 and 12. I think that's something that is going to require a real revolution, such as like what we see happening at Scots College, with alternate pathways into further education that is not ATAR oriented. Perhaps I'm putting forward a view there, but perhaps that is the way. But certainly, once you start getting that initial interest by a teacher that has got an external resource support, like what's happening at USyd with the way in which they engage with local schools, where they've got other reasons to engage with schools that are not just for monetary for the knowledge. You know, universities are a wonderful way. We're looking at we ourselves are under an enormous threat with our financial viability at the university space, and we're searching for new pathways. What better way to drive new ways to get students into universities, but to be the knowledge partner for high schools to show this is the way that curriculum can be developed within your schools. That's where I see the opportunity being at play, and I think there are examples of where that's already happening, and that can be spread nationally.
Thanks for that, Baden. I'm conscious of time. We've got about a couple minutes left. What I might do, again, we're going to be wrapping this up and then have an after the chat where we can let our head down and say all the things we didn't necessarily get a chance to say, and people are welcome to keep watching after that. Di, I might just hand it over to you to kind of reflect on what just happened here, and what do you see as some of the next steps?
What just happened was there was a heap of passion and a really collective vibe from the chat was going nuts. Everyone is really motivated towards making a difference here, and I think that's incredible, but we have to do something with it. And I guess, you know, talking around what are the things that we need to do, and there was a couple of general things that came out of that. There was, you know, listing of all the initiatives, and we've seen that come through the chat. There's the sharing of the resources amongst everyone that's involved, so there's not that duplication. Building the sets of best practice and examples, because they exist out there, but sharing that and being, you know, how do we broadcast that into the wider community, because our local communities play such a vital role, and that's really with that connection from an industry enterprise piece right through to the universities. And then that final point and that discussion around settling on, does this fit in on top of, aside to the curriculum, and how does that meld with something that's so outcomes focused, and is that the right way to go? So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think what this conversation has done is really bring those to the fore, and I think we're, you know, hopefully going to be able to drive off this, which was definitely the hope from this conversation. So thank you everyone for your time.
Thanks, Di. And I just echo that as far as thanks heaps everybody for rocking up. This isn't the end of the conversation, both literally and figuratively. Literally, we're going to be having a chat for the next 20 minutes or so and unpack a few things. Figuratively, in the next, so we're going to be sending an email after this, which is going to be asking for your input, expressions of interest on who wants to be part of something bigger. We fully expect 2 or 3 initiatives to fall out of that. Some of those initiatives, for example, we may, you know, will someone raise their hand and set up an association for entrepreneurship teachers in schools? I think Liz just did. Thank you, Liz. You know, but building teams and people, because this is such a complex, wicked challenge. It's bigger than any one person can address. We really do need the broader community. and then creating a bit of a pool of resources. And Thora, thank you very much, is a consistent participant. And he says, look, if anybody's around in my area, can you just stop by and maybe speak to my students? And how do we get this cross-pollination? There's so much wisdom that happened in the chat. So many good thought leaders, as Baden called out, like a dozen of them. And I'm sure we can keep going, of just as many people that could be on the panel as any of us here. So this conversation will continue. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll also send out a link to the Slack channel. We do have a Slack channel for the leaders in the innovation community that we can connect around these kind of topics. So you're definitely welcome to that. But with that in mind, we'll just pause the first session. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. And thanks again to the panelists.
Thanks, panelists. And yes, we are recording and we'll be sending the link out as well. I just saw there was a question come through the chat.
Yeah.